Our skin is an incredibly important organ. It actually reflects the health status of all the other organs and systems in our body. When you ingest foods that are high in or even just well, then you initiate an inflammatory response that can start to really aggravate acne and cause more acne. Just not good to do. It's very clear that diets that are of the so-called low inflammatory type don't spark inflammation. Your skin is going to look so much better, so much healthier, more vibrant. It absolutely will impact your inflammation levels by reducing them. It absolutely will impact skin health and appearance. All of that is going to make you look more youthful. It's not an imagined effect, it is real. Okay, so to start today's discussion, I want to jump right into the deep end, meaning into one of the more controversial issues related to skin health and skincare out there right now, which is sun exposure and sunscreen. It makes sense why this would be such a heated issue, no pun intended, because most everyone is exposed to the sun or has the opportunity to be exposed to the sun to some degree or another every single day, even on cloudy, overcast days. It's also the case that we've learned a lot in the last 10 years or so about how different sunscreens and their components may be good for us, may be less good for us. And today we're going to talk about what is known and what is still unknown. But before we do that, we need to take a step back and look at the context in which all this controversy is happening. My read of the online community as a whole, as it relates to sunscreen and sun exposure in particular, is the following. I didn't say everybody, but most everybody out there seems to accept the idea that excessive sun exposure can cause certain cancers of the skin. That's the general belief out there. And there is good reason for that belief because indeed, the sun as full spectrum light includes long wavelengths. It's probably easier to think about those long wavelengths as the reds and oranges and yellows and so forth that are present. And well, they're always present from sunlight, but they're most obvious to us when the sun is low in the sky, so-called low solar angle sunlight at sunsets and also at sunrise. But of course, as full spectrum light, sunlight also includes UV, ultraviolet light, of different types. We'll talk about those types today, as well as blue light and green light. And in midday sun, when the sun is overhead, we just see the sun as white light, right? Because containing all those different wavelengths. So while this is not a discussion about wavelengths and optics, for sake of today's discussion, just understand that long wavelength light tends to be more of the red, orange, yellow variety, okay, loosely speaking. And down at the other end of the spectrum, the short wavelength light is more of the blue and green and so-called ultraviolet light. So it's well accepted that light of different wavelengths, such as UV, blue light, green light, all the way out to red light, even near infrared light, can penetrate into cells. It can actually pass through surfaces. It turns out that long wavelength light can actually go deeper into the surface of our skin, right? It literally can penetrate just by shining a red light on your skin. It can actually penetrate the skin to a deeper layer than can short wavelength light like UV light. It has been shown to reduce so-called reactive oxygen species, so it serves as a so-called antioxidant, and this relates to what I just said, reduced inflammation, but too much copper is a problem. So I wouldn't run out and start supplementing with excessive amounts of copper. Please don't do that. But you want to make sure that you're getting sufficient amounts of copper from your diet. And you can simply look up online what sufficient amounts of copper are, given it's a trace mineral. And it's very likely that if you ingest any kind of supplement that is a multivitamin mineral supplement or a foundational nutrition supplement, that includes at least some copper. So it's likely that you're sort of quote unquote topped off in terms of the amount of copper that you need, but very unlikely to be excessive amounts of copper. But if you start supplementing with copper beyond that, again, you can induce an inflammatory response. So it's a dosage kind of middle ground issue there. You don't want your copper too low. You don't want your copper too high. You want it right there in the middle. Okay, as I mentioned before, we will talk about other components of food that are great for skin health. And we'll also talk about components of certain foods like advanced glycation end products. I don't know if you've heard of those before, but very interesting, not good stuff that you want to avoid if you can, especially if your concern is youthful looking skin and healthy skin, and frankly, health overall. But before we do that, I think it's worth paying attention to a few things that you can potentially take that can really improve the youthfulness of your skin, for which there is excellent science to support it. Okay, so when I spoke to board certified dermatologists who trained at excellent institutions, what people can do to improve the youthfulness or the appearance of youthfulness in their skin, and that there specifically be peer-reviewed studies to support their statements. They mentioned hydrolyzed collagen protein in combination with vitamin C. We talked about that earlier. They mentioned a bunch of do's and don'ts as it relates to sun exposure and nutrition, etc., some of which we've covered, some of which we are yet to cover, but will soon. And they mentioned supplementing with niacinamide. Niacinamide is a form of vitamin B3. It is also sometimes referred to as nicotinamide. And I was told that when taken at twice per day, at a dosage of 500 milligrams per dose for a total of 1 gram or 1,000 milligrams per day, that niacinamide supplementation can increase the production of ceramides, which relate to the lipids in skin that improve the moisture in skin. And by the way, moisture in skin is a key component of the youthfulness or plump appearance of that skin. And when I say plump, I don't necessarily mean outwardly rounded plump. I mean the fact that the skin looks like the outermost layer of the skin, which you now know as the epidermis, is kind of taut, and the skin looks hydrated and smooth at the level of its outer appearance. All of that is improved by niacinamide supplementation, but that the supplementation has to be carried out for 3 to 6 months or more before that effect is noticed. Now, the origin of the niacinamide effect on the youthfulness of skin could also be related to the fact that there's evidence that niacinamide supplementation can reduce inflammation of skin overall. We haven't talked so much about the immune-skin relationship, although as I alluded to at the beginning of the episode, this is a key relationship. But for those of you suffering from rosacea, from acne, so rosacea being a reddening of the skin, we're going to talk more about it later and specific things that can be done for it. Acne almost always involves some reddening, often painful reddening of specific pocks on the skin, sometimes even the appearance of pus-filled bumps, this sort of thing. That niacinamide supplementation may also assist there because of the reduction in inflammation, and we'll talk all about the relationship between inflammation and acne. Regardless of whether or not you suffer from rosacea or acne or not at all, that niacinamide supplementation may benefit you. Also, because niacinamide supplementation appears to balance the level of oil production in the skin, you need oil in the skin. You need oil down in those pores, but not too much. And that it can definitely help reduce the appearance of clogged pores. And if you're concerned about pores that appear too large, this typically happens in the face, around the nose, on the upper cheeks, although other regions of the body as well. Niacinamide supplementation may assist with that as well. There's also a number of people out there that are concerned with specific spots that they see as hyperpigmented spots. So regardless of whether or not overall your skin is very light or very heavily pigmented, supplementation with niacinamide can reduce the appearance of accumulation and maybe even the actual accumulation of melanin at particular spots, so-called dark pigmented spots that some people decide that they don't want for whatever reason, usually just cosmetic reasons, although there may be reasons why hyperpigmentation in a given area could relate to skin cancers. We talked about that earlier. Another reason to go get not just your moles, but all of your skin checked at least once per year. Now, if you decide to supplement with niacinamide, you have the option of either taking that 1,000 milligrams in 2 500 milligram dosages per day. You also have the option of using any number of different topical niacinamide ointments or serums that exist out there. Keep in mind that many skincare products already contain niacinamide, so check the label. And there, the dermatologists tell me that to be effective, the niacinamide needs to be present at least a 2 and as high as 10% concentration within those ointments or serums. Keep in mind that many serums and ointments also contain what's called hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is a natural component of the skin that provides a physical substrate for holding in water, so moisture within the skin. It does a bunch of other important things too within the extracellular matrix and elsewhere, the regions between the cells, that is. And supplementation with hyaluronic acid or ointments or serums that contain hyaluronic acid and niacinamide are pretty common out there because of the already stated effects of niacinamide, and the fact that hyaluronic acid can serve as what's called a humectant, something that serves to barrier in moisture at the level of the skin. Okay, so it gives that kind of plumping, moist look of skin that's characteristic of youthful skin as opposed to aged skin. The dermatologists and the cosmetic surgeons that work on faces, I told you I consulted with a fairly large and diversified group of folks in preparation for this episode, all agreed that supplementation with collagen, vitamin C, niacinamide, and hyaluronic acid was something that they suggest to their patients. The other supplement, well, actually, it's a prescription treatment most often that dermatologists recommend if the goal is youthful appearing skin, are things within the so-called retinoid pathway, such as retinol. Okay, many of you have perhaps heard of this, and it's a whole story related to the relationship between vitamin A and skin. Okay, so tretinoin is the common name for it, although some of you may know it as Retin-A, and prescription drugs that are similar to that with their little paws, and they'll stand up and they'll like signal flash one another from across the prairie or whatever it is, across the lawn to signal to one another. So they're sending UVP signals across the lawn. I'm not making this up. I actually studied a little bit of this when I was an undergraduate, but not at the level of the urine and the signaling, at the level of the retina. Any discussion about skin has to include a discussion about nutrition. Why? Well, remember the fact that I mentioned at the beginning of today's episode that your skin and your immune system have a very intimate relationship. It's bidirectional. Your skin reflects the status of your immune system in many ways. And this is why many people with autoimmune conditions, things like lichen planus, you can look it up, or if you mind particularly striking photographs, please don't look it up. But People that have autoimmune conditions, that often manifests in skin conditions. We'll talk more about this in the context of psoriasis in a little bit. But anytime we're talking about the immune system or skin, we need to take into account the gut microbiome and nutrition. So many people asked, what are the things that they should eat to have healthy appearing, youthful skin? They also asked, what are the things that one eats that could exacerbate things like acne, and what can one eat in order to reduce their acne? So let's just start off with the basics. And here I'm going to be fairly brief because I think we all know the big take-home message about nutrition nowadays. We hear over and over again, and we should pay attention to the fact that the vast majority of our food, well, I should say, if one desires to be healthy, mentally healthy, physically healthy, and a high-performing individual in any number of different things, cognitive, physical, or otherwise, we want to consume the vast majority of our foods from non-processed or minimally processed sources, so-called whole foods, so fruits, vegetables, if that's within your diet. Some people include grains, some people don't. I'm not here to discuss that. Meat, eggs, fish, chicken, and so forth, if that's within your diet plan or your nutrition, or if you're a vegetarian or vegan, you make the associated adjustments so that you can make sure you're getting enough protein and amino acids, but it's in keeping with your ethical and maybe your health goals. Okay, so we're not here to discuss vegan, vegetarian, omnivore, of which I am, or carnivore. Okay, that's not the discussion. I think all of those groups agree that getting the majority of your nutrition from non-processed or minimally processed foods is going to be best. And that, of course, if you're human, sometimes you'll ingest processed foods, but really trying to avoid highly processed foods is critical. Now, with respect to the specific foods that can improve skin appearance and skin health, it's very clear that diets that are of the so-called low inflammatory type, that don't spark inflammation, so these would be things that sometimes are referred to as the Mediterranean diet or a paleo-like diet. You hear these terms, but what are we really talking about? Mostly whole foods, minimally processed foods, okay? And then make sure that you're getting enough of the vitamins and minerals and micronutrients from your foods or supplement if necessary. But note that caution about vitamin A supplementation in excess. And also make sure you're avoiding excessive amounts of highly processed foods. You know, I mentioned earlier these advanced glycation end products. These are things that are present in a lot of processed foods like crackers and chips and things like that make those foods inflammatory. So you're getting the theme now. Inflammation is bad, not just for the skin, but for all organ systems of the body. It's not just about the high density of calories and the high density of taste present in highly processed foods. Those are problematic, but a lot of the issue with these highly processed foods is the high heat conditions used to make those foods stable on shelves or stable in packaging over time. Okay, so there's a whole discussion to be had here that frankly I don't think can be had enough, but that is outside the scope of today's episode. The point is that when these highly processed foods are basically made, right, they're constructed, they involve the interactions between sugars and proteins and fats at high heat that make them stable on the shelf or in packaging, and those can be very inflammatory. And that can show up in the form of reactive skin. It can make your psoriasis worse. Yes, it can make your acne worse. It can make your skin more tender and painful. It can make your skin basically more reactive to some of the underlying predispositions you might have, either because of genetics or other things you're doing or not doing. Maybe you're going through a particularly stressful time. Maybe you're getting a little bit of extra sun and you're eating more highly processed foods, and those things are combining and making your skin break out or flush more than it would ordinarily. Again, there's so many reasons to eat most of your foods from non-processed or minimally processed sources. And of course, and now I sound like a broken record because you can hear this all over the internet, ingesting foods that are excessively high in sugar, excessively high in sugars combined with fats, just not good to do. Pro-inflammatory, it's going to cause all sorts of issues. And we're going to get into this more as it relates to acne in particular, because as you probably know, when you ingest foods that are high in sugars or even just carbohydrates generally, that also contain a lot of fats, and in particular when those foods are highly processed, well, then you initiate an inflammatory response, and you often can initiate additional things happening in the pores of cells that can start to really aggravate acne and cause more acne. This has to do with the whole insulin pathway. So when we talk about acne, I'll talk about diets that create a high glycemic load. We're not necessarily talking about the glycemic index of food. You may know that when People measure the glycemic index of food. They're looking at the blood sugar response after eating that food, typically in isolation and not in combination with other foods. What I'm talking about is eating combinations of foods that induce high levels of insulin, high levels of blood glucose, that then lead to all sorts of things in the hormone pathways and cell growth pathways that exacerbate acne. So we'll get there in a moment, but I think the take-home message around nutrition is pretty clear. So much so that I don't want to spend any more time on it. We all know what the best nutrition really is for us, regardless of whether or not you're vegan, vegetarian, omnivore, or carnivore. It's non-processed or minimally processed foods representing probably anywhere from, let's say, 75 to 100% of your food intake, depending on how strict you want to be. As delicious as the donut or French fries, right? There's a reason people love these foods. They're so delicious. They do cause problems. They're pro-inflammatory. Does that mean you can never have a French fry? No. You decide what's best for you, but know what you're doing. As a segue to talking about acne, we need to talk about the gut microbiome. And this is a direct outgrowth of our discussion about nutrition. Here's the simple takeaway that I believe everyone should follow, not just for sake of healthy appearing skin, but also for sake of every organ and tissue system in your body, which is the data clearly show that ingestion of sufficient amounts of fiber, so prebiotic and probiotic fiber, so fruits, vegetables, sometimes this can also come from grains. Some people will supplement with additional fiber if they feel they need it, as well as ingestion of low sugar fermented foods. I've talked about this before, so regular listeners of this podcast may have heard this. Things like kimchi, sauerkraut, the sort of sauerkraut that has to stay in the fridge. So not the stuff that's stable on the shelf at room temperature. Anything containing a brine, that salty brine. So pickles, but not the pickles that are stable at room temperature, the ones that have to be kept in the refrigerated section of the grocery store. These low sugar fermented foods are powerful enhancers of the gut microbiome. And when the gut microbiome is healthy, you have reduced overall inflammation in the body. This is often reflected at the level of the skin. And basically, skin health and the youthfulness appearance of skin is enhanced, okay? This can also help with conditions like acne or psoriasis, especially in conditions where there's a direct immune system skin relationship that we'll talk about more in a little bit. Okay, so I highly recommend people have anywhere from 1 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented foods per day, or try and enhance the health of their gut microbiome generally. Maybe you take a pill probiotic, although those can be very expensive. There's a little bit of data suggesting that if you chronically take pill probiotics that yield very high levels of bacteria, well, then maybe there's some associated brain fog. That's a little unclear, pun intended. But, they are very expensive. They have to be kept refrigerated. And let's face it, low sugar fermented foods, if you find the ones that you like, are really great to ingest because they're tasty and they're good for you. Now, why am I talking about this? In part because we keep coming back to inflammation as a general issue for skin health. And that points us also towards some specific do's and don'ts as it relates to lifestyle. Let's face it, pun intended. If you sleep well, so maybe you need 6 hours, maybe you need 7, maybe you need 8, maybe you need 9, but if you sleep well on a consistent basis, your skin is going to look so much better, so much healthier, more vibrant than if you are not getting enough sleep. If you drink alcohol, and you wake up the next morning, your skin's going to look puffy. It's not going to look good. But many of you can ingest alcohol without issues. I've done an entire episode about alcohol. The blood vessels or the broken blood vessels that then call in immune system cells to clear out the destroyed endothelial cells and other stuff around it and take it away, get rid of those blood vessels that sit beneath the surface. Let's talk about psoriasis. So when I was researching this episode, I asked the dermatologist, is psoriasis related to yeast or overproduction of skin cells? And what they told me was really interesting. They said for more than 80 years within the dermatologic community, it was thought that psoriasis was just an overproduction of skin cells, but it wasn't really known what the source was. And it turns out that now almost all the derms, at least the ones I spoke to, said that it has something to do either directly or at least powerfully and indirectly with the immune system. So what can be done to treat psoriasis? You can probably guess. Things that reduce the overall level of activation in the immune system. Not so much that you become susceptible to infections, because that's not good, but you treat this like any other autoimmune condition. There are now drugs, these are prescription drugs, that directly target the interleukins, the components of the immune system that are directly involved in psoriasis, such as interleukin 17 and interleukin 23. And I'm told that these drugs are very effective in the treatment of psoriasis. So that's very reassuring. I know, especially in communities online that are focused more on behavioral tools and nutrition-based tools or supplementation-based tools, of which I am, right? We focus on those. But as you probably noticed in this and other episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we also talk about prescription drugs that have proven to be very effective in certain conditions. So it's very reassuring to hear that there are excellent prescription drugs that can target the specific interleukins that are overactivated in psoriasis, because psoriasis is now known as an overactivation of the immune system and a kind of turning of the body on itself, if you will, to create this itchy, scaly, uncomfortable, and in some cases unsightly overproduction of skin cells at the scalp and elsewhere.